prompted by the intentional crashing of Germanwings Flight 9525 on March 24, 2015, the subject of little-discussed pilot suicide became a hot-button topic. Instances of such an action are not common in commercial aviation, but have occurred several times in the last 30 years. The following is an examination of the variant lengths that some have reached to end their lives involving an aircraft. February 9, 1982. Japan Airlines Flight 350 was nearing its destination at Haneda Airport in Tokyo when 35-year-old Captain Seiji Katagiri sent his DC-8 toward the water just outside the runway. Two other crewmen restrained him and attempted to correct the aircraft's descent, which was credited in saving nearly 80% of the passengers. The plane crashed in Tokyo Bay, killing 24 of the 166 lives on board. Oddly enough, one of them was not Katagiri. He would later stand trial for what was deemed a psychosomatic illness, which resulted in him being found not guilty by reason of insanity. 12 years later, Agadir, Morocco. Royal Air Maroc Flight 630 was only in the air 10 minutes when Younes Kayati disconnected the autopilot and directed the aircraft toward the ground. The 32-year-old captain had reportedly just ended a relationship that left him despondent. According to French aeronautics officials in charge of the investigation, co-pilot Sophia Fagugui relayed to air traffic control, "Help, help, the captain is..." But the transmission was cut off. Moments later, all 44 people on board were killed when Kayati slammed the plane into the Atlas Mountains. The Moroccan Pilots Union did not agree with the assessment of pilot-assisted suicide. 1997, December 19th. 35 minutes into its flight from Indonesia to Singapore, Sik Air Flight 185 suddenly lost altitude over the Musi River in Sumatra and disintegrated upon impact, taking with it 104 lives. The 34,000-foot descent was so rapid that the aircraft approached supersonic speed after only a 60-second dive. Due to this rapid a fall, it is believed that decompression within the cabin would have resulted in a loss of consciousness for all aboard prior to the impact. Dozens of passengers sitting near the rear of the aircraft were already outside the 737's body when the tail section became detached from the fuselage. Conflicting investigations would take place between the American NTSB and the Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee. While the NTSB would conclude that Captain Su Wei Ming, distressed over enormous recent financial losses and airline reprimands, downed the plane, the INTSC saw it differently. Initially in agreement with the NTSB findings, the INTSC stated they could not determine how and why the accident happened. It is a long-held belief that this conclusion was reached to minimize the dozens of class action lawsuits that had been filed against the airline. Halloween, 1999. Egypt Air was in the midst of a stopover during a routine Los Angeles to Cairo run. Shortly after departing JFK Airport to complete the rest of its journey, Flight 990 was deliberately driven into the ocean by crewman Gamil al-Batouti. Unlike other previous pilot suicide occasions, the crash was initiated by a co-pilot. Al-Batouti was also one of the oldest suicide pilots on record, as he was only 3 months shy of his 60th birthday. Much like the opposing impressions between the NTSB and the Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee, the NTSB was again met with a dissenting opinion. Because the craft's registry origin was not in the United States, the Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority led the inquiry into the tragedy. Overwhelmed by the manpower necessary to conduct an examination on this scale, the ECAA signed over responsibility to the U.S. to take over the investigation. Flight voice recorders picked up al-Batouti saying, "I rely on God" in Egyptian Arabic. Captain Ahmed el-Habashi, who had left the cockpit momentarily, returned in a state of panic as to why the engines had been shut off. Al-Battuti had also engaged the craft's elevators in a downward direction. The elevators on a wide-body jetliner are flap-like pieces located on the tail that affect pitch, and this action caused a critical dive. Falling nearly 15,000 feet in a little over 30 seconds, Captain el-Habashi had corrected the elevator on his side and began pulling the plane up. The CVR recorded him asking Battuti to do the same, but the FDR indicated that his co-pilot did nothing. El-Habashi had actually managed to raise the 767 back up to 24,000 feet, but the violent pressure exerted on the aircraft to this point resulted in a total loss of power and the breaking up of the plane. All 217 lives on board met their fate in the waters off Nantucket Sound. Due to Egyptian culture's strong abhorrence of suicide, the ECAA was outraged at the NTSB's findings and reopened their own investigation. They later determined that a mechanical failure of the elevators was the cause. 14 years would pass before the next occurrence, when Flight 470 of LA Mozambique Airlines went down in Bwabwata National Park, located in Namibia. Halfway to its destination, Captain Herminio dos Santos Fernandez manipulated the controls of the Embraer 190 to a set altitude level of 592 feet from its current position of 38,000. He also had increased the plane's speed to its maximum limit, 541 miles per hour. This engaged the craft's emergency systems as CVRs picked up the sounds of alarms wailing and the co-pilot banging on the locked cockpit door. The doomed passengers were subjected to 7 minutes of terror, knowing their fate was imminent, falling 100 feet per second. The plane ultimately plummeted into swamplands and was scattered over a 2,000-foot area. Because of fierce rains in the region, it was originally speculated that weather was the cause of the crash. But the NTSB, asked to participate in the investigation, presented findings that the captain was responsible with a clear intention of downing the jet. 33 people were killed. March 24th, 2015. One of the youngest perpetrators of pilot suicide, 27-year-old Andreas Lubitz, drove a plane of 150 into the French Alps, disintegrating the craft on impact. German Wings Flight 9525 had departed from Barcelona en route to Dusseldorf, Germany, with a scheduled flight time of just under 2 hours. 30 minutes into its trek, moments after briefly crossing the Mediterranean Sea into France, air traffic control indicated that the flight began to lose height. Transponder data indicated an adjusting of the autopilot's cruising altitude to just 100 feet. As was the case in all other pilot suicides, the perpetrator seized a lone moment in the cockpit to lock the door to the main cabin. Captain Patrick Sondenheimer had briefly exited to presumably use a restroom, but upon return was unable to gain access to the flight deck. Analyzed voice recorders detailed calls from Sondenheimer to Lubitz to open the door, as well as unknown objects being slammed against it. Tower requests to Lubitz were not responded to, though reports indicate his steady breathing could be consistently heard. Entry was again thwarted when the cockpit door keypad code was futilely punched in several times to no avail. It is believed Lubitz disabled the code from the inside, a post-9/11 measure that had been implemented years earlier. Sondenheimer attempted to communicate to Lubitz via the onboard PA system, still to no response. The total time for the craft to leave its level of 38,000 feet and meet its end was 10 minutes. Marseille public prosecutor Bryce Robin informed media outlets that screams from the passengers were only audible seconds before impact. Documents found in Lubitz's home suggest he had a diagnosed mental illness that he concealed from his employers. The latest incidents of pilot suicide have prompted several entities outside the United States to consider a rule of at least 2 people in a commercial airline cockpit at all times. At first, a handful of airlines themselves implemented the change, but ultimately entire countries also issued mandates. Britain, Norway, Australia, Canada, and of course Germany were among the first to shift to the new format. The U.S. has long since had this standard in place, including a provision that a flight attendant must take the chair of any pilot who excuses himself from the flight deck. Though there has never been a case of a U.S. pilot of a commercial airliner committing pilot suicide, there have been at least 24 instances of U.S. pilots of private planes who have done so in the last 20 years. 2002 was a particularly consequential year for pilot suicide via private U.S. aircraft, as nearly 10 examples can be cited. 2002 had started with 3 pilot suicides nearly in one day. Things began on January the 4th in Sonoma County, California, when a well-to-do building manager learned he was wanted in connection with a child molestation. Police, after searching the man's residence, contacted him at another location, requesting that he turn himself in. Instead, he headed for Petaluma Airport and, once there, commandeered a single-engine plane. The suspect was still in training for his pilot's license and did not own any aircraft, thus prompting him to steal the plane from his flight school. After less than 5 minutes in the air, he willfully drove the plane into the side of a mountain. It was later discovered that he had been abusing the daughter of a female employee for several years and, realizing that he would soon be arrested, devised his way out. The young victim's mother would suffer a breakdown, causing the child to be put into group homes for nearly 2 years. She wouldn't return to her mother until the end of 2003 and was ultimately awarded $8.4 million through the man's estate. Barely 24 hours later, a 15-year-old Tampa, Florida pilot in training was left unattended near a 2000 model Cessna 172 when his instructor asked the student to perform a pre-flight inspection. The boy then boarded the craft and started the engine, the instructor on the outside of the hangar. Moments later, the boy departed St. Petersburg Clearwater International Airport. A brief passover of MacDill Air Force Base, just a few minutes away, ensued, the plane eventually finding its way into downtown Tampa. A U.S. Coast Guard helicopter pulled even with the plane and made eye contact with the teenager, gesturing for him to land. The boy ignored the requests and sailed the Cessna into the side of the Bank of America tower, where he was killed. The wings detached from the craft and fell to the street 29 stories below, but no one on the ground or in the building was injured. The reason for the flyover at the Air Force Base was linked later when a suicide note inside the plane had the boy identifying himself as an Osama bin Laden sympathizer. His mother later sued an acne manufacturer for $70 million, claiming it was their product that caused her son's suicidal break. But the lawsuit went nowhere after 5 years. At nearly the same time in Boulder, Colorado, a 54-year-old pilot with nearly 20 years of flying experience had his plane collide with a mountain. Local coroners ruled suicide due to the level of antidepressants in the man's system. The FAA's Civil Aeromedical Institute in Oklahoma City is routinely sent blood samples from victims of air accidents and found the same results. The decedent's mechanic noted that the man had become very withdrawn in recent years, and the pilot's wife stated that her husband had been seeing a psychotherapist. He had failed to indicate on his most recent FAA medical application that he was taking any form of antidepressants. The FAA does not allow pilots to fly on these types of medications. It took 2 attempts for one man to succeed in June of that year, when a 30-year-old Tampa, Florida resident made his first attempt with a helicopter, crashing it into a home. Only 10 hours after being released from a hospital with only minor injuries, he would down his own twin-engine plane into a woodsy swamp, taking his own life. Obscure circling patterns over the airfield and non-communication with both common traffic advisory frequency and police helicopters led investigators to believe the subject was well aware of what he was doing. His last maneuvers were to climb 100 feet for 12 seconds, finally making a right descending 360-degree turn toward the swamp. An autopsy detected a blood alcohol content 3 times the legal limit allowed by the FAA for pilots. Positive analysis of antidepressant drug zolpidem and insomnia medication citalopram were also present. The flyer had only minute traces of each in his system following the first incident, but had 12 times more zolpidem in his system at the autopsy after his death. He had no previous history of violent behavior, but a long list of traffic-related arrests and infractions. A different form of pilot-inflicted death took place outside of Houston, Texas in November. An experienced pilot and NASA engineer contractor was up in a single-engine Cessna with a flight instructor. Only a few minutes into the flight, the engineer asked that the plane be banked left for a better view. When the instructor was looking the other direction, the engineer undid his own safety belt, opened his door at 9,000 feet, and leapt to his death. It was later discovered that he was under investigation for the receiving of stolen NASA computer equipment. Authorities found a suicide note in his car, and it took over 2 days to discover his body in a remote field. One of the few helicopter-related suicides took place in 2006. A 21-year-old Italian native living in Montana was attending a Super Bowl party with friends. His girlfriend, also at the party, had informed him that she no longer wished to be in a relationship with him. Upon the conclusion of the get-together, the man headed for the helicopter company in nearby Butte, where he was employed as a flight instructor. Almost 11:30 at night, the business was closed, so the young man used a passkey to gain access to a hangar and took the outfit's oldest chopper, a 1999 Robinson R-44. The young man phoned the home of his girlfriend, but because of the late hour, only got an answering machine. He stated that he couldn't go on and that he was running out of fuel. The girlfriend's mother picked up and had a brief conversation with him where he stated how he wasn't thinking clearly. He also indicated problems with his own family and wished that his girlfriend's mother was his own. The phone call was then disconnected. A radio call was also placed to air traffic control to say that he loved America and didn't want to hurt anyone, but no mention of the fuel situation was made. He then forced the rotorcraft into the ground of a hayfield just off a highway at 12:17 a.m., igniting a fireball. Though the family refused to believe the young man would commit suicide, crash investigators noted that the craft was not in a custom emergency landing position, and that the fireball indicated plenty of fuel was available. A 3-page suicide note was found in his home, with some indications made to both his relationship status and that his visa was about to expire, possibly forcing him to leave the country. A toxicology report revealed a great deal of alcohol in his system at the time of the crash. An occurrence of both pilot and passenger fatalities came from March of 2007. A Bedford, Indiana woman had reported her daughter missing when she discovered her 47-year-old ex-husband had not dropped the 8-year-old off at school after a weekend visit. The woman placed a call to her ex-husband's cell phone, when he picked up and said only, "You're not going to get her." She had no idea where the man and child were and pleaded for her daughter's return. The little girl could be heard asking in the background, "Mommy, come get me." At approximately 11:30 a.m., the woman went to the police department to file a missing persons report. Sadly, she was unaware that just 45 minutes earlier, her ex-husband had flown his leased Cessna aircraft into the rural mobile home of the woman's mother. Though her mother was unhurt, the woman's ex-husband and child were killed. The grandmother's home was only a half-mile from the runway of the small airport of takeoff, but for whatever reason, the man flew for an hour and a half before the crash. Authorities could only assume that he wanted to spend one final morning with his daughter before directing the plane toward his ex-mother-in-law's home on approach, presumably in an attempt to kill her too. Because most municipal airports are unmanned, no one was present to stop the child from boarding the craft with a student pilot, who, though they can make solo runs, are not permitted by the FAA to fly passengers. Passenger suicide has been resorted to at times. A 2013 case similar to the pilot jumping incident out of Houston, Texas in 2002 saw a 60-year-old West Covina, California man pay $300 for a helicopter tour for two. When he showed up alone, the pilot thought nothing of it and took the man up. Halfway into the flight over Newport Beach, the man undid his safety harness, scuffled with the pilot, and plummeted into the waters 500 feet below. Authorities say at that height that it would have been relatable to hitting concrete. Stunningly, the jumper survived, his body remaining completely intact. Lifeguards waded 45 feet into the surf to retrieve the man and began performing CPR. Emergency units arrived on scene and transported the subject to a nearby hospital, where he would die from his injuries. The brother of the deceased stated that the man had been enduring a long-suffering illness that involved him choking incessantly at night. Unable to procure the funds necessary for a surgery, the consensus of his family was that he decided to end his pain by ending his life. There was even the unusual case of an empty passenger jet used for an attempted escape and ultimate suicide. In the early morning hours of July 17, 2012, a SkyWest Airlines pilot, using a piece of carpet to protect his body, scaled a razor wire security fence at the small St. George Municipal Airport in Utah. He located a 50-seat commuter jet sitting on the tarmac, broke into it, and started its engines. Without use of a towbar or safety tug, he attempted to steer the plane himself toward the runway at around 1 a.m. But because of his proximity to the building, he ended up clipping a passenger jet bridge, then shearing out a chunk of a terminal wall, losing a portion of his left wing in the process. This caused the plane to turn out of control and crash through the same fence he had jumped and into a rental car parking lot where several vehicles were damaged. On the run for 3 days after murdering his girlfriend in Colorado and realizing the plane was now useless, the man used a handgun he had carried on board and shot himself to death. Despite all of these examples, a 10-year FAA study from 2003 through 2012 found that pilot suicide is actually down from the 10 years prior. They reported only 8 aircraft-assisted suicides in this study, which was down from 16 from the 1993 through 2002 period. The participants have always solely been male and mostly middle-aged. The youngest was 21, the oldest 69. Since 1979, there have been over 40 U.S.-related pilot suicides of private aircraft, and dozens of others internationally. The reasoning behind this action run the gamut, from simple depression, financial hardships, relationship dissolution, revenge, criminal activity, and terminal illness. Many psychologists theorize the motivations for pilot suicide of commercial airliners are not unlike those to mass office or school shootings. They feel it is apparent that the killer wants to take people with them to suffer along with them. Though the guilty party will not have the chance to experience any presumed self-satisfaction to their infamy, the fragility of their conscience isn't able to reason that. The influence of prescription medications is often learned after the fact, with several pilots' medical evaluations